On the morning of February 27th, 2026, the world woke up to news that left millions in silence. Neil Sedaka had passed away at the age of 86. According to his family, he felt unwell in the early hours and was rushed to the hospital by ambulance. By the end of the day, at the hospital, the heart of the man who wrote some of the happiest melodies of the 20th century had stopped beating. His passing was quiet. No stage, no spotlights, no cheering crowds. Only an almost unbelievable silence for a man who once had the world singing along to his joyful choruses. His wife, Liba, along with their 2 children, confirmed the news, calling him a true rock and roll legend and an inspiration to millions. But behind those formal tributes lies a deeper truth. Neil Sedaka's music was never just cheerful tunes. For decades, he was known as the man of happy songs. Tracks that made people smile, sway, and remember their youth. Yet when looking back at his journey, from dazzling heights to a period of being overlooked, and then to a remarkable comeback few believed possible, it becomes clear that behind those lively refrains was a story of resilience, of fearing being left behind, and of refusing to let an era define his worth. His death not only closed the life of an artist, but revived a question that prompts reflection. How could someone write the brightest melodies while experiencing such profound ups and downs? And perhaps to understand that, we must return to the very first piano keys of a boy in Brooklyn. Before becoming a pop icon, Neil Sedaka was just a boy growing up in Brighton Beach, Brooklyn, New York, a working-class neighborhood where immigrant families crowded together amid unfinished American dreams. Born on March 13, 1939, Sedaka showed musical talent early, surprising even his parents. At just 9 years old, he began studying classical piano, and soon the family's small apartment echoed constantly with the scales of Chopin and Beethoven. While other children played ball in the streets, Sedaka spent hours at the piano, repeating passages until they were perfect. He didn't just want to hit the right notes, he wanted to understand the structure, to feel why a chord could stir the heart. That discipline was no accident. His family believed music could open doors they had never had, and they were right. At 13, Sedaka earned a scholarship to Juilliard School, one of the world's most prestigious and competitive music institutions. For many, that would have been the pinnacle of a classical dream. The Brooklyn teenager now sat among exceptional talents, studying harmony, counterpoint, and performance technique under strict standards. Everything seemed set. He would become a classical pianist, performing in grand halls under warm golden lights. But amid sonatas and etudes, something else was growing within him. Sedaka loved academic structures, yet he found himself drawn to short, memorable melodies that could make an entire room sing along. He realized that what made him happiest was not just technical perfection, but the moment music connected people. That realization led him to a bold decision: to step away from the prestigious classical path and enter the risky world of pop music, where no one could guarantee his talent would be recognized. At 16, Neil Sedaka made a decision many teachers at Juilliard might never have supported. He chose pop music. Together with his close friend and longtime collaborator Howard Greenfield, Sedaka began writing songs simpler in structure but rich in emotion and irresistibly catchy. They had no luxurious studio, just a piano, pen and paper, and the belief that joyful melodies held as much value as any symphony. That risk paid off quickly when Sedaka signed with RCA Victor, one of the biggest record labels of the time. Then in 1959, everything exploded. Oh, Carol, written about his then-girlfriend Carole King, was released. The song didn't just climb the charts, it became a phenomenon. Its upbeat melody, unforgettable chorus, and Sedaka's clear voice captivated a generation of American teenagers. Then came Calendar Girl, Happy Birthday, Sweet 16, songs seemingly made for endless summer radio play. But the true peak arrived in 1962 with Breaking Up Is Hard to Do. The track reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, placing Sedaka among the biggest pop stars in America. He became a familiar face on television, appearing on primetime music programs, touring to sold-out venues filled with enthusiastic fans. Young girls screamed when he stepped onto the stage. The press dubbed him the Golden Boy of Pop. What made him unique, however, was that despite the lightness of his music, Sedaka never wrote carelessly. Behind every cheerful melody was a solid foundation of classical harmony. He knew exactly what he was doing with each chord, each modulation. He blended the refinement of Chopin with the teenage spirit of early 1960s America. In that moment, nothing seemed capable of stopping him. But music history never stands still. Only a few years later, a new wave from across the Atlantic would change everything and push Neil Sedaka from the position he once thought secure. In 1964, everything shifted within months. The arrival of the Beatles on American television was not just a debut, it was a revolution. Longer hair, edgier sounds, a rebellious spirit. Soon after came the Rolling Stones and a flood of other British bands dominating the charts. History would call it the British invasion. For many American artists, it was a challenge. For Neil Sedaka, it was nearly a collapse. His once beloved music was suddenly labelled outdated. Radio stations stopped playing his hits. Record sales plummeted. Venues that once sold out began to thin. The change did not happen gradually. It came abruptly, coldly, and without mercy. Just years earlier, he had topped Billboard. Now he watched his name disappear from the charts. The most painful part was not financial failure, but the feeling of being left behind by the very generation that once adored him. Sedaka was not yet 25 when it happened. Too young to be considered the past, yet famous enough for the fall to be public. In an industry where youth was everything, he was suddenly seen as a relic of a closed era. But instead of surrendering, he stepped back. Sedaka began touring in the United Kingdom, ironically, the very place that had sparked the wave pushing him from his peak. There, he still had loyal audiences. He continued writing music, composing for others, refining the harmonic skills that had always been his deepest foundation. Those years were not glamorous. No blinding spotlights, no #1 positions, only quiet perseverance and the belief that his music was not finished. And in that silence, Neil Sedaka began preparing for what few believed possible, a comeback rarely seen in pop history. By the early 1970s, few in the music industry were betting on Neil Sedaka. He was a once famous name, but no longer current. Then a younger artist at the height of global fame saw what others overlooked. Elton John publicly called Sedaka his idol and signed him to Rocket Records in 1974. It was more than a contract, it was recognition across generations. Elton John understood the refined melodic structures in Sedaka's compositions, recognizing the classical foundation beneath the sweet pop exterior. This time, Sedaka returned not as nostalgia, but as a more mature, seasoned artist. Then the unthinkable happened. Laughter in the Rain climbed to #1 in the United States, 15 years after his first golden era. Next came Bad Blood, a duet with Elton John, which also topped the charts. 2 #1 hits in a completely different decade, before a new generation of listeners. Few pop artists in history have achieved that. Perhaps the most symbolic moment was when Sedaka re-recorded Breaking Up Is Hard to Do as a slow ballad. Once an upbeat early 1960s pop hit, it became a heartfelt, emotional love song, and once again entered the top 10. The same song, 2 styles, 2 eras, both successful. It was not just a comeback, it was proof that true talent can adapt without losing its essence. Sedaka did not blindly chase trends, he adjusted, matured, and allowed his music to grow alongside his audience. After years of being considered past his time, he stood on stage again, not as a shadow of the past, but as living evidence that passion and persistence can rewrite history. Even in his 80s, Neil Sedaka stepped onto the stage with energy that astonished younger audiences. He was no longer the slick-haired boy of the 1960s, but once seated at the piano, nothing seemed changed. His fingers remained precise, his voice warm, and his smile carried the sincerity that once moved millions. There was something special about Sedaka. He never allowed the bitterness of being forgotten to alter his music. He had every reason to become cynical, to write darker songs, yet he continued choosing bright melodies, not because his life had always been easy, but perhaps because he understood the ups and downs so deeply that he valued the light even more. Songs like Laughter in the Rain and Breaking Up Is Hard to Do may sound simple at first listen, but they hold something rare, the ability to make listeners feel lighter in just a few minutes. That is a rare gift. On February 27, 2026, when he passed away at 86, the world did not just lose a singer. It lost part of its collective memory. First dates, sweet 16 birthday parties, rainy afternoons listening to music on an old radio. But his music did not disappear. It continues to live in those ordinary moments. If you grew up with Neil Sedaka's melodies, or are just discovering him today, share in the comments which of his songs touched you most. And don't forget to follow the channel as we continue exploring the stories behind music legends, where sometimes the truth is even more moving than the lyrics themselves.